I want to start off really by giving the context of the debate that we're having on work class and resistance today, and it's this. It's the fact that from 1979 onwards there have been very fundamental changes in the structure of British capitalism, and alongside this, neoliberal reforms, attacks on work, living standards and organisation, and yet to the massive frustration of socialists, the level of struggle has been relatively low. It's been very difficult to organise workers independently of the union bureaucracy, and the union bureaucracy time and again have failed to lead and organise the very visceral anger of working class people over pay, over pensions, over austerity, despite the fact that we're experiencing the biggest fall in living standards since Victorian times. And anyone here who's in the UCU, the University and Colleges Union, will be very, very aware of how the leadership have managed to turn a pay dispute that could win into confusion by having 2-hour strikes instead of 2-day strikes and rolling back the sort of powerful weapon of a marking boycott. So it's this sort of frustration that's led to a number of debates within, among socialists and within the movement about class, about what's happening with work and what the possibilities of resistance are. And there have been several propositions that have been put forward which we're going to be really debating in the workshop today. The first one is that neoliberalism is a universal development that's characterised capitalism for the last 3 or 4 years and is a very fundamental break with what went before. And the argument follows from that it's changed the working class so fundamentally that traditional areas of organisation are in decline, and that low levels of union membership in the private sector means we need to develop a new approach to unionisation. It's also been argued that neoliberal capitalism has changed the nature of work itself, that precarity is increasing, and again that 0 hours contracts makes it difficult to organise workers. And the final debate, if you like, is that neoliberalism is not simply a material reality, but somehow it's led to the decline in collective consciousness on the part of workers. Okay, now, because many of the changes in working class and work have been linked to neoliberalism, I think it's very important to start by locating it in the strategies of how the ruling class manage capitalism. And if we look at the origins of the term, it goes back to 1947 when a group of economists, most well known Friedrich von Hayek, drafted a statement arguing that the state should have a limited role and that private property and competition was central. Now at the time, these people were seen at worst as being slightly nutty and at best as being completely sidelined, because this really didn't fit with the way that advanced and many other capitalist economies were organised during the period of the boom. But of course that very abruptly changed by the mid-1970s. In the mid-1970s, that we talk about the long boom, actually in historical retrospect it looks relatively short, that the sort of tools that have been used to manage the system during the 50s and 60s no longer worked. And what happened, spearheaded by the US and the UK, was a reorganisation of capitalism under what Chris Harman talks about as the rubric of neoliberalism. Now, I want to just look at the argument as to whether there is a direct relationship between neoliberalism and changes in work and the working class. And just before I do that, I think it's very important to say that neoliberalism is not a coherent strategy on the part of people who manage capitalism. Firstly, it's pragmatic. Secondly, they don't agree amongst themselves. And it is constantly challenged, actively or passively, by workers. But the main point that I want to make is that the reshaping of the working class in the UK has actually taken place over a much longer period of time. And secondly, we have to distinguish between what are general trends in capitalism and what is peculiar and specific to British capitalism. Now, in all advanced capitalist economies over a long period of time, there has been a shift from manufacturing to the so-called service sector. Now, this is a real one. It's not simply a consequence of neoliberalism. It's actually a consequence of long-term increase in productivity, which means very simply that fewer workers are required to generate more output. And what that's meant over time is that there are fewer workers in manufacturing and actually a whole new range of workplaces, whether they're airports or supermarkets or call centres, that are the new workplaces. And on top of that, there's been an absolutely massive expansion in those jobs that, if you like, reproduce and maintain labour, in education and employment. So in 2009, across advanced capitalist countries, 1 in 10 people worked in the health and care sector. And what this means is there's been a massive expansion in jobs, the jobs that women do in these sectors, which puts them at the centre of the working class and at the centre of working class struggle. And it's just worth noting that the last time in Britain that there were more people working in manufacturing than the so-called service sector was actually 1911. So those are trends that are common to all advanced capitalist economies, but actually there are some very specific factors that have shaped what work and the working class look like in the UK. And especially the fact that Britain has had a very, very long-term decline in competitiveness. So that was evident even by the 1960s, when in other countries, Japan, Germany, the number of people who worked in manufacturing was increasing, and in Britain that was falling. And of course, again, by the mid-1970s, those real weaknesses in the British economy were starting to be very apparent. And rather than the state retreating in the 1970s, at the beginning of the neoliberal period, actually the state had to bail out British Leyland Cars, shipbuilding and British Steel. Now, this is the important backdrop to changes that took place after 1979. And between 1981 and 1984, there was a massive contraction in the number of people that worked in manufacturing in the UK, to the tune of at least 17%. Monetarism, which is another kind of part of the neoliberal repertoire, pushed up interest rates to really high levels. Now, what that meant was it wasn't Thatcher's policies per se that brought about this massive contraction in manufacturing. What it did is accelerated and amplified a tendency that was already there. So alongside that, the other story about the British economy is really the growth of finance. And again, if you look at during the 1980s, whereas there was a 1% growth in investment in manufacturing, investment in banking, finance and business services grew by well over 8%. So now in Britain, unlike other countries, it's the third biggest employer. Now, the rise of the service sector has led to some muddled thinking about what we mean by productive labour. And in particular, there is an idea that is around that somehow jobs outside of manufacturing are not productive. And I think we should be clear that for Marxists, a job is productive if it creates surplus value for a capitalist. And that is the same whether someone produces a car or whether someone produces a service that's sold on the market. And there's also some other muddled thinking, I think, and that's probably a kind way of putting it, about the public sector, which is that somehow public sector workers don't have the power. And it is the case that they don't have the power to hit capitalist profits directly, but indirectly they contribute to surplus value. The system simply would not operate without schools, universities, a health service to reproduce labour. Secondly, and I think a lot of people in the public sector would find this completely risible, is the idea that public sector workers are a salaried bourgeoisie. Now, perhaps there are a few of them, but actually the public sector, which is the suggestion of Zizek, but actually the public sector has 1 million low-wage workers, a far higher number than was previously estimated. Workers in social care, classroom assistants, are people who are absolutely trapped on low salaries. And thirdly, as I'm sure Phil will talk about in a lot more detail, the sort of indignities and management techniques that have usually been associated with factories are applied in schools and hospitals. And again, if anyone is in any doubt about this, last September I came back to work to find in my pigeonhole a badge which said "Here to help." So very, very like, and it was remarkably similar to the sort of badges that you get in Asda. So this whole commodification and transfer of private, what goes on in the private sector being brought over into to the public sector. And finally, for those workers who are still in manufacturing, their power is not diminished. In fact, it's much greater because they're largely locked into complex sort of value chains where a stoppage by one group of workers brings the whole system to a standstill in a matter of hours and at the very most days. Okay, would you give me a 5 minute call? Good. Okay, so I want to say something about precarious labour, because again there is an idea around that there is increased precarity, and of course this argument has its high point, or probably more correctly a low point, in Guy Standing's book The Precariat. Now this is something of a straw man, and it's quite easy to demolish his arguments, but there is a very serious argument to be had about precarity. First of all, they are horrible contracts. They rob workers of security, pensions, sick pay, and very few people choose to be employed on those conditions. But we do have to be cautious, because they are not a new phenomena. They are a rebranding of the sort of insecure work that has always existed under capitalism for a small layer of workers. And the estimates are very varied. They vary from something like 1% and 4%. And it's actually quite hard to measure them accurately because they cover up quite a wide range of different sorts of contracts. Now, they've always been around in hotels and restaurants renowned for bad pay, poor unionisation and seasonal work. But actually what's a bit more shocking is the fact that they are prevalent in parts of the public sector, in health, in further education and higher education. But what was very stark, and I was just looking at some figures when I was working out what I was going to say today, but between 2000 and 2010, in Britain, not so true of other countries, in Britain, the number of people on part-time, fixed-term or self-employed contracts in the UK has virtually not changed at all. So, we have to be very cautious about conflating all of these contracts and creating this category of precarious work. Now, I want to take two examples, actually, from a magazine that the UCU Left edits. And it has two really good examples, I think, of how we should think about precarious work and how we should organise. The first one is an article by, I don't know if she's here, Jenny Sutton, and it's about the cleaners at her college at Cornell. Migrant workers, who I don't have a chance to talk about, who've significantly changed the composition of the UK working class, who do largely some of the worst jobs, and again are seen as peripheral precarious workers. Well, a really good account of how the UCU, along with the GMB, unionised workers and managed to roll back and have a victory on attacks on pay and working conditions. A second article is by a comrade from London Met, which seems to come bottom of the league for everything. It's about 0 hours contracts. And what she looks at is, first of all, the extent to which they exist in FE and HE. And she looks at how these workers are hard to organise. Quite often people with 3 jobs, they're marginalised, but nevertheless, she starts to find some strategies, organising a meeting, raising demands in the workplace between full-time and part-time workers that will win. So I think this is where the argument needs to be. I think we do need to understand, if you like, the empirical questions, but we also need to look at what the real opportunities are for organising. And just finally, I think it's important to say that there are limits to casualisation. And the limits to casualisation lie in the fact that, as Kevin Dugan said, the basic proposition that capital needs labour. And what they do is constantly tread a path between trying to employ people cheaply, get lots of work out of them, and the fact that they need to invest in skills and training in order to get people to be productive and to produce things. So, just one very quick comment, and then I'll sum up. The last thing that I only have time to mention, and perhaps we can talk about it in some of the discussions, is there is an idea around again that somehow neoliberalism is not just a material reality, but has permeated and polluted the minds of workers and diminished their collective consciousness. Now, just quoting from something that Mark Thomas wrote in the last Socialist Review, he looked and analysed the most recent British survey of attitudes, and that really doesn't support that at all. It shows people continuing to identify themselves as working class, understanding that class has a very marked effect on people's opportunities, and surprise, surprise, large numbers of people, large majority in favour of renationalising the railways, the post office, and energy. And even 52% of Tory voters support that. So that doesn't mean that there is mass support for revolutionary socialism, but it does show that that sort of social democratic consciousness endures, and that, if you like, the neoliberal rhetoric which pervades not only the coalition but also the Labour Party actually is not embedded in the consciousness of working class people. Right, I'll sum up. Now, undoubtedly, there are significant changes to the shape of work and the working class. That's always been the case, and it will be true in the future. Where people work, the endless menu that bosses use to extract more work from people constantly changes. You know, the one thing that we know about capitalism is it's an incredibly dynamic system. But what doesn't change is the very basic fact of exploitation that lies at the heart of the system. And it doesn't matter whether you're a miner, a call centre worker, a nurse, a lorry driver, a Tesco's, all of those people are ultimately subject to having more work extracted from them. Not because employers are nasty, although lots of them are, but it's because it is a central feature of the wage relation. And finally, you know, we all understand that there is immense frustration at the low level of activity, but we have to avoid the sort of magic bullets looking for magic bullets that can overcome the problems. And we have to avoid the rhetoric of precariousness and impotence, because that undermines raising confidence and combativity. And we have to look for the examples of workers at Hovis which show that there is the potential for organising, and those things are not simply inevitably foisted upon us.